In this episode of The Breakdown, I am here in New York City with Sony Artisan Ben Lowy, and we're going to talk about some tips for shooting street photography. Welcome back to The Breakdown. My name is Miguel Quiles, and I am here in New York with Mr. Ben Lowy, Sony Artisan. And so tell everybody a little bit about yourself.
Well, I'm a Gemini and I like long. No, I have done a lot in photography in terms of like working in different genres over the years, and that's kind of what I like about photography and having a camera. For me, for my career, it's been about a lot of experimentation. I started, doing conflict work for about a decade. I moved on to sports for a while. I've done fashion. Right now, I'm working primarily underwater. Doing a lot of work with sharks, but you can't do that on the streets of New York.
No, unfortunately. Well, there are some sharks.
There are some sharks.
But not that kind of sharks.
Land sharks.
Right.
I always have been inspired by street photography, by walking around, by seeing the city, by using photography and street photography as an excuse to explore, to go down a different road, to look at places that I have no reason to go to. It's harder to do when you're working constantly, but there were a lot of times when I was younger where I didn't have as much to do and as many jobs, and I would just find myself walking across the whole city and really trying to create this work. And it's where you actually find out a lot about yourself, how your eye works, how you see, how you sketch and conceptualize your approach to photography, what you notice, and how your mind thinks about image making. I am pretty, I'm like one of those people who stacks coins and makes sure all my wires are in, like, collected, and even if they're like behind.
I believe that's called OCD.
Yeah, well, I mean, I like to be organized, and it comes through in a lot of my images. I like, especially when I'm really trying to compose a lot. So for me, street photography, when I'm not doing it as a photojournalist or as a storyteller, when I'm just going to explore, for me it's all about, the thing about photography is you are trying to control the serendipity of life. Right. In any part of photography, you're trying to compose and you're trying to make an image, not take an image. Everyone else who has has their camera phone in their back pocket, they take pictures. And we as photographers, what I think separates photographers from everyone else is that you're trying to make an image. You're trying to construct it, not by moving things around, but with your head, by putting yourself in the right spot and waiting for the perfect moment. And so for me, specifically when I'm doing street photography, it's about that organization and that composition and moving things around so I get it just right. So I definitely have a pretty anal sense of how I want to do that. Right. So it's a lot about negative space, it's a lot about light, and it's a lot about waiting for that moment where someone comes in and inhabits that perfect spot in that light or in that negative space. That makes street photography so poignant for me. I love Gary Winogrand's work, and that's one of the first photo books I ever bought. When you look at it, it's about the content, it's about the expression, the people that he came across, where composition wasn't as important to him. And that's where, like, the content came first. And for me, I learned a lot about that when I was doing my storytelling work, but what attracts my eye is not that. Right. It's seeing shafts of light within the city, it's seeing these spaces that people inhabit.
We can actually talk about that, because that's kind of like, I have 3 questions I want to ask you, and one of the questions is going to touch on that. So we'll save that one for a sec. So let's talk first, because what I want to do is I want people to be able to get like a sense of how you do what you do. So the general questions that I think, lots of drugs, right? The general questions that I think a lot of people get or give are, how do you approach your camera settings when you go out to shoot street photography? Generally speaking, like, what are you doing in terms of your settings?
I actually sometimes think that my normal photojournalism work or my underwater work, I really do like it with a shallower depth of field, where you can really bring out certain details by getting rid of all the other, I would call it ambient details, like background details that you don't want. So I definitely shoot with a much wider open aperture. Well, no, not that much, but you know, occasionally I've shot f2 or f4. You know, underwater probably like 5.6, whereas more common, most underwater photographers shoot around between f8 and f11.
Right. But what about in the street?
In the street, you know, it really depends. Am I moving fast? Do I have time to think? Am I just staying in one spot and waiting for people to move through it? And then you really don't know where your exact plane of focus is going to be. So maybe that's when I'm like, oh, I'm going to mix this up and put this up to f22 or f16 and just focus on one space, and then everything else, you know, and have like a really big depth of field where a lot is going to be in focus, and like let it rip. It depends if I'm really trying to get that crowd shot with many faces illuminated. Do I want to create, I love layers. I love having like a really strong background and foreground and other things going on. And there's a lot you can do with it. If you're like, you can layer with like, you know, you can layer like, you know, you have like leaves behind us. Like you can layer with that, but let's say you don't want the detail of the leaf. You just want it to be a green blob. Right. Well, then you'll open wide versus closing down. And I think, you know, having that creative control is great. So, especially because I'm shooting raw, what I'll do is I'll find that great middle ground to the light. That'll be my setting, whether that's f8 at, you know, 200th of a second, at 400 ISO, that'll be that. And then I'll, you know, I can still shoot whatever and move it around, you know, 1 or 2 stops. You know, with my aperture.
Generally shooting at a higher shutter speed then? Like you're shooting at the
if you are moving,
right,
and your subject is moving, or moving across the plane that you're photographing, yeah, I want to shoot with a higher shutter speed because I don't want motion blur. Right. If your subject is coming towards you, you know, I feel like I want a higher shutter speed, at least around you know, 200, to make sure that I'm freezing the motion. Yeah.
So let's talk about lenses. And I know there's always kind of this thing where people say for street photography they just use 35mm. That seems to be the most popular focal length for shooting street portraits or street photography. But what do you tend to use the most? And what's like your favorite focal length for shooting street photography?
I mean, definitely my favorite is the 35. I think a 35 is wide. I mean, 35 is wide enough to get most. Sometimes I wish I was like slightly wider, but then you take a step back.
Right.
You know, when you take a step back from a 35, it's a 24. Right. When you take a step forward, at least my step. When you take a step forward, it's a 50-ish. Right. I mean, you don't have the same compression, and you don't have the same this like wide open sense that you would get with a 24. But it's a good all-around lens when you don't want to be changing too much. Right. But again, you know, it depends. Like, there are times where I've gone out and shot with a 135 because I just felt like having this kind of long look at everything. And it's a very different feel. It's less intimate. But then again, sometimes when you shoot with 35, I'm not trying to get like this on a person. That is not my style and my approach to shooting. So I think it's a really good idea to play with different lenses when you're out there. I mean, I travel with the 50 and the 35, and those are kind of my go-to, but like I also have, you know, a wider lenses, and I also have longer lenses, and it, you know, it depends how I wake up that day and what I want to shoot.
Right. All right, so let's talk about how you approach street photography creatively. So we talked about the lenses, we talked about camera settings. Creatively, what are you looking for, and what would you recommend to photographers to look out for when they go out to shoot their own street photography?
Well, you know, for me, street photography is an excuse to explore.
Yeah.
But it's also a way to see and try and see a world that we already know exists. Like, let's say New York City, you have this preconceived idea of what it already looks like. Right. So how can I be creative and try and show it a little bit differently? And so for me, that's what my exercise is. Like, how can I approach with my unique, you know, proclivities for how I see? What can I do to create and make an image that is in a place that people already have this idea that of what it looks like, and I want to show something a little different. So, you know, for me, light is really important, negative space is really important, using objects to help my composition, whether that's other people, whether that's things and reflections and really heavy foreground.
So what kind of things are you looking at? Like when you're saying things, what is that? Are you looking at
heavy foreground elements that I can use to place people within spaces?
Right.
Like even scaffolding is amazing because you can use it almost in a way as like cutting through and creating this actual golden rectangle and putting people within space. You know, I love doing that, and it's a real exercise in patience and waiting and waiting and waiting for. You know, you will never run out of people walking on the street in Manhattan. Exactly. So that, you know, there's just
plenty of opportunities.
And you know, everywhere I look, I see a picture. I see the. Let me tell you about. Everywhere I look, I see the potential for an image.
Right.
And then I wait for that image to happen. And it's a little bit different than waiting and reacting instantaneously to something that happens in front of you, which is a perfectly good way and great. You know, traditional street photography. It's not kind of how my photographic mind works, is I see something and I say, this space, this environment speaks to me about the city, and then I wait for a denizen of the city to inhabit that space. And
it kind of reminds me of how people used to do when they shot film back in the day, because you only had, 24 or 36 exposures, so you didn't go and just rattle off. I know. It was this thing back in the day. It was pretty cool. But it kind of reminds me of those days where you would go out and you would be very judicious of the shots you took. And you would sit and you would wait for something to happen in the frame.
Well, I mean, like Gary Winogrand, not necessarily judicious, died with 10,000 rolls of film still not developed. And if you ever watch video or film of him shooting, he would shoot, and he would just keep on going. And that's one way to do it. It's just, it's not how I think. And I appreciate the photographers who do that, but I am always looking for some way to control the chaos rather than just picking moments out of the chaos, because that's what it is. That's what life is. Life is chaos. And we, as photographers, we're trying to put the chaos into this little rectangle. And so that's hard enough.
Right.
And then to make it even harder is like, how can I even make it more so?
Right.
All right, everybody, so we just wrapped up a really fun morning of shooting. We will see you in the next episode of The Breakdown. Bye, everybody.